Matthew, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Daniel.
It's a real pleasure to have this opportunity. We first connected online a few years ago when you were very generous in your comments about my book about yoga history and philosophy. And at that time, I was firstly bowled over that anybody had read it, and secondly, that somebody who had such a deep I guess, engagement with Dharmic traditions more broadly, not just yoga, but Buddhism also, would find some merit in it. And I was touched, and I kind of wanted to return the favor. And time has flown, and here we are 3 years later. But I really want to, honor what you've been sharing and my appreciation for a lot of what you're putting out on social media. In a very, real, unvarnished way, talking about how these principles relate to the real business of living a complex life as a human being in the 21st century. So that's why we're here today. Looking forward to some of your stories and some of your insights.
And who said we can't make friends through social media?
There you go. Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, the theme, I suppose, that's hanging over it for me, which inspired me to reach out, was your contribution to a book called Recovery Dharma. And that's presenting a path out of addiction through Buddhist principles and practices. And I was struck by some of the ways in which it made very clear parallels between the precepts of Buddhist tradition and also the practicalities of getting out of an addictive hole, and also intrigued as to how that sort of presents things slightly differently to the traditional 12-step recovery path. And that's one of the things I'd really like to get into. But first of all, I'd like to come to you because you've got your own story in this updated edition of the book. And you introduced that on one of your websites. So I'm just going to read out what you said because I can't do it justice. It's very, very succinct and to the point. My suffering was inescapable. It was time to do something different. And I think that really gets down to the core of how the Dharma applies to this situation. And I wonder if you could bring that sentence to life for us a little bit and tell us, where you were and why these principles were helpful to you.
Yeah, I guess we have to kind of decide how detailed we want to get with my suffering, but I suppose a certain amount of it is probably appropriate for the conversation. Um,
Mm.
I mean, as a general theme, I don't think people come to spiritual practice because everything's okay in life. I think the gate for spiritual practice, not just a Buddhist dharmic practice, but any type of spiritual tradition, I think people who come to it, not necessarily raised in it culturally, but people who seek it, they're seeking it because there's some suffering, right? They're seeking it because there's some discontent. Maybe it's existential discontent, or maybe it's like real life, everything's falling apart, and I need to do something different. That was certainly my story. Um, the shorter version of it is I found myself involved in drugs as a teenager. Eventually, found myself addicted mostly to methamphetamine, but we call people like me a trash can because if you had it, I said yes. And so I did do everything, but the one that really took me out was methamphetamine, and this is in the kind of the height of the meth epidemic, if you want to call it that, in America. So this would have been the mid to late '90s, and eventually led me to dropping out of high school. It led me to being unemployable for obvious reasons, and I started stealing. Uh, I want to say it started out as stealing to support the habit, but if I'm being perfectly honest, stealing itself became an addiction unto itself. So it makes sense to say that I was both a thieving addict and a meth addict, and was eventually arrested for that stuff and caught a prison term when I was 18 years old. So I got sentenced to 5 years, 8 months when I was 18 years old, and I ended up in California prisons at the time. I paroled when I was 21 years old. And even though I recognized that drugs and alcohol to a lesser extent had kind of put me in that particular predicament in my life, uh, I didn't really want to stay sober. I kind of told myself it was the hard drugs that were the problem, but come on, I'm 21 years old. I'm allowed to drink now. I've never been to a bar. You know, marijuana is starting to become quasi legal in California. Like, who doesn't want to smoke a little pot? This is where my thinking was at the time, of course. And so I completed my parole after coming home from prison, and I started drinking and smoking a little pot, and I went to college, and I was doing pretty well. You know, life was okay at the time. Uh, and it was around that time that I took at my local junior college, I took a year-long kind of survey course that was in three separate quarters that dealt, generally speaking, with Eastern philosophy. And I remember doing the Buddhist segment. And it wasn't like a deep dive. It was kind of a survey of some of the traditions and the basics, Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path, non-self, suffering, impermanence, that sort of stuff. But I remember feeling like it felt familiar. It felt true, like something really, really resonated with the way that the teachings were presented by a non-Buddhist teacher, just an academic teacher. But something really resonated, and I said, you know what? That's true right there. But I didn't think I was suffering enough to do anything about it, so I kind of filed it away somewhere for for later, because I was living life and having fun. Uh, but the fun only lasted so long. A really, really close friend of mine commit suicide maybe a year or two after this. This would have been 2003. And I swiftly became a daily drinker, and I relapsed on meth 2 or 3 months after that happened. And I'm not blaming him uh, for my relapse and all that. I'm just it's the context in which this all happened. I didn't have the ability to cope. Um, I don't think death had ever touched me that closely. And I said to my partner at the time, I feel like the world has crumbled in around me. I feel like something has been pulled out from underneath me. That's just what it felt like. And uh, I followed the same path I had 7 or so years earlier. I slowly, well, I shouldn't say slowly, quickly became unemployable again. Started stealing again. I was more prolific because I was an adult. I wasn't like living in my parents' house like I was the first time. And so I got myself in a bunch more trouble again, started stealing again, and was once again arrested. This time, the consequences were a lot more severe. I'm not sure if you're familiar in the UK with three strikes laws that we have here in America.
I'm not au fait with all the technicalities, but it sounds to me that basically, you do things that classify as a certain grade of serious a few too many times, and that's you locked away for the rest of your life, pretty much.
That's pretty much it. So I was facing what came to be about 400 years to life
Wow.
for for my crimes. Again, it was stealing from garages, cars, and some homes. But each one of those crimes was sufficient for a life sentence. So they were stacking it pretty hard against me.
Could I just ask why it was deemed that serious? I mean, I get that you were stealing people's property and that's, not to be encouraged, but it's not the same as, holding people up with an assault rifle and, potentially shooting one of them in the process. It's a different sort of crime.
Well, this is this could turn into a political discussion, but the way the three strikes law was passed in the I think it was the mid '90s was they marketed it as for violent crime, right?
Yeah.
And but they said serious or violent or serious felonies, and nobody really asked what serious meant. And so in my case, the serious crimes were the places when I stole something from a residence where someone lived, and they
Hmm.
classified those as serious and therefore strikeable. And the other part of the three strikes law that came into to play with me is part of the law was that if you already had strikes before, then any felony crime was a third strike. So,
Hmm.
for example, one of the crimes that I was charged with was possession of methamphetamine, but because I'd already been convicted of strikeable offenses before, that was worth a 25 to life sentence unto itself. So, if I remember correctly, in the second arrest, I think I had one strikeable offense, one serious felony. All the rest were what we consider not serious or non serious felonies, but because of my prior record, they all warranted a potential 25 to life sentence. That, by
Thanks
the
for
way, has since
clarifying.
been changed. I think the law was changed in 2013 or 14. So now the third strike has to be a strikeable offense, which means technically I still would have gotten 25 to life. I still would have faced 25 to life, but it wouldn't have been 400 uh, if the same thing had happened today.
Which
So there
boggles
are
the mind. I mean, yeah, 400 years.
what's the point, right? Might as well
Exactly.
Give me 1,000. I mean, I met people who got 100-year, 200-year sentences during my time in prison, and they just never really made too much sense, but this is what they do.
I guess the logic in some way, and I suppose that's what I'm kind of coming back to in my thinking about it, is that somebody is trying to basically run a slide rule over things and say, here's somebody that we don't want on the streets. And you had, for whatever reason, fallen into that category. Did you see yourself that way when, this kind of reality of facing that much time stares you in the face, or did you just think this was insane?
Well, I was biased, right? So, on, we have a committee. We all have a committee in our head, right? And so there's one part
Yeah.
of me that absolutely knew what I was doing in the consequences, especially since I'd already gone to prison for having done those things. So from a game theory perspective, I knew what I was doing. I knew what the potential consequences were. I knew the risk factors involved in it. But uh, from another perspective, I also thought giving anybody a life sentence for non-violent crimes like that was also kind of ridiculous, and I still feel that way. But just to kind of put it in perspective and to bring it back to like the addiction part of this, I remember a couple of months before I was arrested, I was doing some sort of calculus in my head. I'm like, what is a good burglar? Like, what's the success rate of a good burglar? Like, if you're a baseball player in America and you hit 300, right, 30%, you're like a pretty good batter, right? So, like, what's a good batter in terms of being a burglar, like I was? And I said, let's just say I get away with 99.9% of everything. You know, I did this calculus. I said, how long is it going to take me to eventually get arrested and face the rest of my life in prison? And I remember it was like 120 days or something. And I knew that. Like, I remember knowing where this was going and also not being able to stop myself.
Mm.
Uh, I was in a dark place, and that's the stealing part, but just the death of my best friend, my partner left me at the time as well. Um, I had a lot of suicidal ideation. I think the suicide of my closest or my oldest childhood friend kind of threw a wrench into my thinking about what was possible in life, in the sense that I never thought of suicide as a possibility. And after he died, it felt like an option. And so I was filled with a significant amount of shame and remorse when I'd quote unquote wake up in the morning, though I wasn't always going to sleep. But when I would sober up a little bit, I had a lot of shame and remorse around what I'd found myself back in. And I would say to myself, I can't take this anymore. And then the drugs and the alcohol would take the edge off of that. And so, in some ways, staying loaded kept me living, right? It saved my life. And of course, then there's the vicious cycle of being loaded and then continuing to steal. So it was just this cycle that in some part of me knew was only going to come to an end when I got arrested. And I was kind of resigned to that.
In some
Uh,
ways, then it was almost like I would hate to suggest that you valued what happened to you, but there's a line that you highlight at the end of your essay in the Recovery Dharma book that says sometimes, these painful things that happen can actually be catalysts for something very good coming out of them. And it seemed like that was, the moment at which something really did shift for you when you went back inside again. And there was this possibility of transformation. This is not going to continue if I do something differently. But if I continue in this way, obviously it is going to continue, and it's not going to have an opportunity to for some time because I'm inside. But while I'm here, there is a chance to do something differently that will make it possible to do something differently outside. And I'm curious where that came from in you, that sudden reappraisal.
well, it was there early on in the county jail. After I'd been arrested, I was facing the rest of my life in prison. My oldest friends was dead. My then partner, my first wife, was leaving me. Uh, Life didn't feel so great. I like anything that I'd been suppressing for the prior year or two since I'd kind of fallen off the deep end, that was all bubbling up to the surface. I couldn't avoid it anymore. And I had just a sense of desperation, I guess. And so I decided to do two things. One was maybe I need to work a program of recovery. And my thinking wasn't because I really wanted to work 12 steps. My thinking was uh, it can't get any worse than it is now, so I might as well try it because the worst thing that could happen is nothing. And the second thing I did was I decided to pick up the Dharma. And that was when I remembered that college class I'd taken years earlier where I kind of told myself, this is true, but I'm not suffering enough. Well, I decided then and there that I was suffering enough to give it a shot. And that's kind of where that part of my path started. Now, you had mentioned kind of obviously I'm with Recovery Dharma today, but I did get sober originally in 12 step because it's what was available at the time. And as I'm sure you're aware, there's some theism in the 12 step model. There's I won't call it explicitly Christian, but it has a lot of Christian undertones. Many of the meetings have the Lord's Prayer in them. Um, if you go to certain parts of America, it's understood that they're talking about Jesus, though they won't say that explicitly at meeting level. And so none of that stuff really appealed to me. If anything, I would have thought of myself as uh, an atheist at the time. Maybe even kind of like one of those angry atheists. The condescending type of atheist. And I think part of what appealed to me about Buddhism was that, at least as the way I had encountered it, the way it was being presented in the early books I started reading, was kind of a psychologized variant, right? A psychologized version of the Dharma that felt really, really appealing, in the sense that this is a practice I can pick up without actually also having to pick up any particular cosmology, any particular theology. Um, it's professed to work regardless of whether you believe in any of like the spiritual or even like metaphysical stuff, like whether you believe in rebirth or karma and all that stuff. The practices themselves are still applicable.
Yeah.
So you'll hear Buddhists like Thich Nhat Hanh say stuff like, you can be a better Christian and practice Buddhism. You can be a better Muslim and practice Buddhism. You'll hear things like that. And so there was that part of it that was appealing to me. But um, as I developed practice over the years in jail, and continue to do 12 step on the side, I found that I basically had to translate most of the questionable stuff in 12 step into Dharmic language, right? Like the third step in AA is turning my will and life over the care of God as I understand Him. And then there's seeking through prayer and meditation to improve a conscious contact with God. Of course, it's got meditation mentioned in there, which is a nice thing. Um, there's the sixth and seventh steps which talk about kind of defects of character, and the notion of essentially just praying for grace
Mm.
to have those things removed. And those are things that I didn't quite subscribe to, but I was desperate enough for things to be different that I was willing to give all of it a shot, even if I wasn't wholeheartedly like in belief of what I was doing.
There's definitely an agency that seems to be there in Dharma practice, in the sense that, right here, right now, in this moment, the causes and conditions are set in motion for what's coming in the following moments. And therefore, how one acts is very significant. The idea that one doesn't necessarily need to do anything other than ask some other power to make it all go away seems a little less agency based. I'm sure it has its merits, and I know it works for people. I have friends who, have successfully quit drugs and alcohol through 12-step programs. But for me, that was always, an obstacle that would never have made me fully engage. And so I can see then that there might be also at the same time things in Buddhism that need a little bit of adapting to not push people's buttons too much. One of the things that really stood out to me looking through the work in Recovery Dharma was the emphasis on wisdom. And so instead of this traditional presentation of the Eightfold Path as having these components that can basically either be installed correctly or incorrectly, so you have right view, right intention, etc., or wrong, it talked about wise. So there's wise speech, wise action. And I wondered what might be behind that sort of choice of phrasing, and whether there were other things that needed softening around the edges to try and remove any kind of sense of judgment that people might immediately feel on reading.
Well, there's definitely language in the book geared towards not trying to turn off the people who are, say, coming to Recovery Dharma because they didn't like the religiosity or the
Mm.
theistic elements of a 12 step, and not trying to turn them off immediately with just a different version of religiosity, right? So even though people know that uh, Buddhism and the Buddha are related to a religious tradition, it's pretty explicitly stated inside that you don't have to adopt particular beliefs, you don't have to adopt um, any particular theology. You can just come here for the practices because we're based. It's like a Buddhist based program or a Buddhist inspired program or a mindfulness based program rather than a program that requests that you believe something in particular. So we invite folks to just to try the practices. And I think the use of wise kind of is in the same sphere of thinking, right? The wise versus right. Even though I think the traditional the translations of the Eightfold Path, it is more in alignment to say right. Um, and I think those of us who've been in Dharma practice for a long time are okay with using the word right. But I think right also brings to mind like commandments, maybe,
Mm.
like a certain type of absolutism that in honestly probably is one of the things that turns people off from 12 steps sometimes is so wise brings to mind like the discernment that's necessary in walking the eightfold path, and the fact that like all of the all parts of the eightfold path kind of unfold in in a way that means that like 5 years ago my understanding of what wise action would have been is completely different than what I think of wise understand or wise action is today. Like my definition of what mindfulness was a decade ago is entirely different than what mindfulness is today. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that I wasn't practicing wise mindfulness a decade ago. It's just wise given the understanding I had at the time, right? And these things change over time. It's just like our five precepts. I'm sure you're familiar with the five precepts in Buddhism. You know, basically non-harming, non-stealing. Um, what are they all? Not
Non-lying.
not lying, no sexual misconduct, and no intoxication. Now you could totally interpret those as the equivalent of Buddhist commandments if you want, but we call them training precepts, meaning like ultimately the purpose is to use those to kind of figure out ways of situating them in our lives such that we in some way cause less harm progressively over time. Not that you're just a bad Buddhist when you break one of them, but can the stretching the limits of a precept lead to just growth in that particular department? And so again, like my idea of what non-harming is today is different than what it was a decade ago. And so, yeah, use of wise instead of right falls kind of in the category of making it more palatable for people when they come in. Um,
Per-
yeah.
Perhaps we should back up just a little bit and really get back to basics for anyone who's not, fully familiar with even, say, the Four Noble Truths, and to clarify just why the project of dealing with addiction maps so well to this framework of philosophy.
Yeah. So the basic framework in Buddhism is the Four Noble Truths, right? And they're sometimes just called suffering, um, cause of suffering, end of suffering, and path leading towards the end of suffering, right? And it's that second one, cause of suffering, that's of particular interest for those of us in recovery, and why it lends itself so well to addressing addiction of some kind. And I should point out, by the way, we're not just talking about drugs, alcohol, and typical substance abuse. Recovery Dharma, the Dharma in general, I think is useful for basically any type of addictive tendency that the mind might happen to have. So we could have sexual addiction or gambling or I don't know, vindictive thinking, social media use, whatever it is, like it's applicable. But generally speaking, the Buddha teaches us that there is um, suffering is a feature of existence, not a problem, but it's just a feature, but that it also has a cause. And then that cause, the Pali word is tanha, which is sometimes translated as thirst, uh, but we also translate it as craving. And as soon as you start to think of of our suffering as being caused by craving, And if you've ever had any addictive tendency in your life, we understand that, like, we know what that craving is like. So addiction, if anything, is just an extreme form of craving, a type of craving that we essentially engage with to such an extent that it destroys part of our life, right? And
Which at which point I feel I have to read the first of the 12 steps, which are printed out because I don't know them off by heart. But we admitted we were powerless over whatever substance it was or whatever tendency or behavior, that our lives had become unmanageable. So this thing has got us under its control to the extent that we're not making the choices anymore. Craving is in charge. So
yeah, craving is in charge, but we also think that we're in charge to a certain extent, in the sense in
yeah.
the and I don't want to do too many generalizations because those could get you those can get you into problematic spaces. But there's this notion in 12-step tradition, which you read, the first step admitting that we were powerless over alcohol, right? I don't think you would hear somebody in the Recovery Dharma space say that they were powerless over X, Y, or Z, right? Whatever their addictive substance or behavior was. If anything, like, I think our language is fundamentally different at that level, because we say that no, we this is a program of empowerment. This is a program of seeing the mind clearly enough that we choose not to follow the craving. You know, we have this notion of freedom sometimes. I don't know if you have it on your side of the pond, but sometimes in America, we tend to think of freedom as being able to do whatever the hell we want. But in a Buddhist framework, freedom is better thought of as like to have the choice not to do what we want, to have the choice not to follow the inclination of the mind, you know, some degree of restraint, right? This doesn't mean we torture ourselves, but it does mean that when the mind wants something, we can be discerning, have that wisdom to recognize that this is a tendency that's not going to lead good places, right? You can play the tape forward. And with long-term practice, this plays out in more than just alcohol, drug use, or harmful behaviors. It plays out in other areas of our life.
The famous example over here may have made its way over there as well. I'm not sure. It's a guy who wrote a book about stopping smoking, and people had told me to read it for years. I smoked 20 a day for pretty much 20 years, and eventually did quit when I finally read the book and was completely sold on what the guy was saying. His name was Alan Carr, and it was the easy way to stop smoking. And he basically compared addiction to cigarettes to wearing tight shoes for the pleasure of removing them. And the only pleasure that one would derive from cigarette smoking, if one was entirely honest about it after many years of commitment, was the relief from the nicotine craving temporarily. And if you can see that all you're doing by having a cigarette is actually setting yourself up for more of the same, then there becomes no great pleasure to hang on to. Sure, there's one or two that seem more pleasurable than others, but actually every one that you have just feeds the beast. So the only way out is just stop right now. You'll be fine. 3 days later, you won't feel so miserable. 3 months later, you'll be free. So I believed it and it worked. I was shocked.
And that's very dharmic. Dharmic in the
Yeah.
Buddhist sense. By the way, when I say dharmic, clearly I'm talking about the tradition within where my practice is. And I know you have an audience that dharmic can mean a whole lot of other things. So, but yeah, that's essentially the Buddhist teaching, and that the things that we chase after, the things that we find pleasant, that bring us pleasure, they unto themselves are dukkha, right? They unto themselves are suffering because they don't have lasting satisfaction. It's not that when you drink some booze, you don't have like a little bit of satisfaction right there. It's not lasting, right? It's not like when you have another piece of cake, there's not a little bit of pleasantness there. Of course there is, right? But it's not lasting. And the nature of mind is such that I think it's got two facets. Is like every time you chase that same pleasant thing, it's just not quite as pleasant the next time. Possibly because novelty plays a role, and with drugs or alcohol or things like that, there's a certain type of conditioning, and that happens. What's the word we use? It's been so long. What's the word we use when we say that?
Tolerance builds up as
Tolerance,
one
right, right, right.
thing.
So I think there's both tolerance to like substances itself, but I think there's a mental component of being conditioned to
Mhm.
what the pleasure is. So
You
on
want
one
a
hand,
better hit. You want the same hit that you
exactly.
got the first time, and you need more to get it.
Yep. And so you're chasing that first high, which of course never happens unless what you use once a year, but then you're probably not an addict anyhow. Um, and then the second element is that whatever satisfaction you do get is inherently unsubstantial. It doesn't last long enough and is replaced again by another craving. And that's, of course, what you're pointing towards, this idea that once the cycle has become vicious enough, we're essentially just relieving craving and not actually getting pleasure out of it. And then we can do the reverse. The Buddha teaches us that it's not just going after things we want, it's also trying to keep the things we don't want away, right? So there's this, I don't know if you ever heard this particular statement, but I heard it said that we are evolutionarily, we are hardwired for survival, but not for happiness,
Hmm.
right?
I haven't heard
Like
that.
there, and our hardwiring says to essentially go after things that are pleasant and to avoid things that are unpleasant or painful. You know, there's a whole spectrum of pleasantness and pain, right? And that the animals that go after pleasant things, generally speaking, whether that's sex or high fat, high sugar foods, and the animals that avoid painful, terrible things like saber-toothed tigers or whatever, cave bears, those animals have a better chance of surviving than the ones that don't go after pleasant things and don't run away from unpleasant things.
Hmm.
So evolutionarily, we're kind of like hardwired to do this very thing, and that's why it's a feature, not necessarily a sign that we're broken to experience the vicissitudes of craving. Right? It's normal, but again, it doesn't lead to happiness,
Hmm.
as anybody who's been addicted knows. It doesn't lead to happiness, and for the most part, in the modern world, sure, um, there are probably things it's good to run from, right? But I know, at least in my life, like I have a tendency sometimes to react to, um, I don't know, particular challenges in life. I can have like the physiological response to, I don't know, slights to my ego as if I were being threatened by a cave bear or something.
Hmm.
And so we've kind of taken like some of this evolutionary history and we transfer it to, like, I don't know, chasing all the pleasant things that are at our local supermarket, right? Like our animal ancestors didn't have heroin available at the corner, booze available at the liquor store, as much like corn syrup available in liquid form as they wanted at the local like market. Like those things weren't available, right? And so addiction to these sorts of things it wasn't really a possibility back then, but now it is. And so to a certain extent, we're paying for our evolutionary history when we indulge in these things. This is the way we do.
It's a great point.
I
And
hope that's not too much of a tangent.
no, no, not at all. This is all rich material because, yeah, in some ways, the Buddha's message about suffering is one that jars with people the first time they hear it, and often misrepresented as life is suffering, rather than that there is this sort of inherent nature of unsatisfactoriness in most things that we can, yeah, try to cling on to because of the very fact that they won't deliver what we're looking for. And it's good to keep remembering that that covers really everything that we can think of. That's not to mean that there's no point having attachments in the sense of, relationships and social obligations, but to be wary in some ways of what we're investing in them and what we're expecting from them beyond a certain point. And that's what the addict isn't really doing. I mean, I know for myself, my particular thing was just cannabis. I managed to get myself into a right state with far too much of that. And it was just the sense that, that in itself would provide the foundation for my happiness. And it did obviously the opposite in the long run. It made me very depressed and introverted and eventually very paranoid. But it was at that root level, the sense that more will give me what I want. And obviously that's the problem. And I think what's interesting when you were saying that recovery dharma and just the dharmic philosophy more broadly applies to everything, is that you might get clean and sober from whatever the problematic substance is. I've heard you speak about California sober, which is to, give up the hard stuff and just be on the medical marijuana, or the legal marijuana as it is these days. But yeah, you can even go beyond that. I upgraded my cannabis addiction to a yoga addiction and used that to hurt my body in all sorts of ways. So there are, endless permutations of this problem that we can experience. And I wonder, as someone who has spent time in 12-step communities, whether there is this sort of ongoing appraisal of the addictive mind in other, contexts as part of meetings, or whether that's something that's more a feature of the recovery Dharma world.
Again, making generalizations could be problematic, and I probably did. So my 12-step experience was limited. I think it's clear now I did not get life in prison. So it was limited
I was going
to
to say we need to come back to that at
probably
some point, but
probably come back to that, but it was limited to the 7 years. I did 7 years in prison on that last term. Paroled in 2012, and did AA very regularly for a couple of years after that, roughly until I had 10 years sober. Um, and now I've also in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area of California. So I also have like a culturally different context for 12-step groups, 12-step meetings, and maybe people who were in, say, the Midwest and in Middle America or something like that. With that said, I didn't see a lot of talk in 12-step meetings about stuff like this. I don't think I ever heard anything remotely resembling the idea of addiction to, um, phones or sex, or I think I'd heard these things mentioned, but there was a 12-step program for it, right? There's like
yeah,
Sex Addicts Anonymous. There's Love Addicts Anonymous, I think. There's gambling. I think it's Gamblers Anonymous. So there are 12-step programs specific to them. But one of the things about a lot of the 12-step programs is they have this singleness of purpose idea, which is that if you're going to an AA meeting, an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, they generally don't want you to talk about any of your addictions that aren't alcohol. And if you go to a Narcotics Anonymous meeting, similar, right? And that's not always enforced, but there are plenty of meetings where it is, where I remember the first time I was going to 12-step meetings back when I was 18, 19 years old and facing my first prison term. Uh, I talked about the fact at an AA meeting, I talked about the fact that I was addicted to meth, and someone from the crowd actually yelled at me and said, "This is an AA meeting. If you want to talk about that, go to an NA meeting." Now, that was pretty impactful to me. But then at the same time, a lady came up to me after the meeting and said, "Don't listen to that jerk," right? So like both of those were present, but as we know, sometimes the loud people in the room, they might be the minority, but they're the loud ones. They're the ones that maybe have the most impact because most people remain silent. So no, I didn't hear a lot of talk about secondary addictions, process addictions, and stuff like that in 12-step. Recovery Dharma, as you know, if you've read the book and if you come to our meetings, I can just look around the room if I know the room well, which I do with my local Sangha, and I know that everybody in the room has very different addictions. We share addictions and we have different addictions. Uh, and the addictions that develop after giving up our primary substance are different too, right? As you mentioned, like smoking, right? Nicotine. I mean, that's one I still struggle with sometimes, like it's a wonderful substance and it's the last vice left, that type thing. Like these are real. Like I think I've definitely had to contend with addiction to either social media or just scrolling on my phone. How is that impacting me the same way that drugs would have in the past? Sure, it's not sending me to prison, but honestly, I'm not so concerned about going to prison today. I'm more just concerned about my mental well-being, my emotional well-being, like my happiness. And these things don't actually lend themselves to any of that. If anything, they create, as you say, more suffering and depression, and it's just a maladaptive behavior in general. And the beauty is that the rubric of the Dharma, the rubric of the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and the practices that you use when you're a newcomer to Recovery Dharma are the same practices, albeit with more skill, because you've been there a while, that you apply to all these secondary or process addictions that arise as we move through life. Because there comes a point, and I've been sober almost 20 years, I'm not really concerned about drinking or using drugs anymore. That's not my thing. But I still have these addictive tendencies come up in other parts of my life, and it's useful for addressing them.
you perhaps give us a flavor of what those practices are, and also, ongoing in your process of maintaining your recovery, what supports you find are necessary to have in place?
Well, I know I put a list of them in that thing my story that's in the Recovery Dharma book, and sometimes it's hard to remember what all of them were. But like the general theme is like I try to stay in touch with people in the same boat as me, other people in recovery. I think that's important. And so that basically means going to meetings regularly to meet with those folks. I I definitely believe in mentorship. I believe I know there's a little bit of an ethos in the Recovery Dharma community that comes from some earlier iterations of the Buddhist inspired recovery communities that had like a punk rock flavor. So there's a little bit of anti-authoritarian, anti-hierarchical stuff. And so sometimes people uh, don't like the idea of teachers or lineages and stuff like that. I am I'm a proponent of that. I'm a strong supporter of there are people that know this stuff better than I do. There are people that have been doing recovery longer than me, and I'll go to them with recovery and addiction related questions. There are people who have been practicing, whether it's meditation or studying scripture. There are people who have been doing those things a lot longer than me and whose development I respect or want a piece of myself. And I go to them, and I think it's important to have mentor and teacher type relationships. Now, I'm not going to go to my recovery mentor and ask him to help me, I don't know, with my mortgage, there's a uh, there's a sphere of influence that I'm willing to give them for me, but I definitely think there's a huge benefit in having teacher-student relationships. Getting involved with service is important to me. In fact, I probably, honestly, I think the bulk of my time outside of work in terms of going and doing things is service related, whether it's with my Recovery Dharma community, the Sangha that I've helped build on Sunday nights in Campbell, California, or whether it's with the Boundless Freedom Project, which is an organization I work with, and I go back into prisons to share meditation, share mindfulness, share the Dharma in ways that I can. Um, Whether it's individually mentoring people, uh, those are things that are really important to me because Buddhism has a certain non-self element. So it's good to get out of the self every once in a while, but it's also just really, really fulfilling as well. I also feel an obligation because people brought recovery to me free of charge. They didn't do it because they wanted anything, especially when I was in prison. These are people who um, went out of their way to leave whatever they were doing at home and walk into like a dirty, nasty, scary prison. And whether it was a Buddhist group and they sat down and they meditated with us and brought us the Dharma, or whether it was a recovery group and they came and they shared their experience, strength, and hope with us, they didn't have to do that. And so I feel like an obligation to pay it forward. Um, yeah, so service, I like to go on retreats. I think retreats are important. And by retreat, I mean like actual degrees of seclusion from society. So the type of retreat where this might just be a more traditional insight, Vipassana style retreat, but I do think times of silence, silent retreat, no eye contact, taking 8 precepts where I don't eat meals at night, putting away the cell phone, not engaging with books or reading material or anything like that, and just practicing, whether it's for 5 days or 7 days or 10 days. I try to do that a couple of times a year. I think it's really important. Because my personal opinion, and I know some folks disagree with me, but my personal opinion is that like there's a momentum to mindfulness practice. There's a momentum that gets built when one is on silent retreat and practicing all day. It's a type of momentum that is very difficult, if not impossible, to build in day-to-day life. I'm an electrician by trade. I spent all week drilling holes in concrete over my head. Sure, I can have an embodied sense of mindfulness while I do that, but I'm not going to spend my time surgically kind of like looking deeply at like the arising and passing of phenomenon while I'm doing that. I got other things to worry about. And so I think silent retreat is really important. And then daily practice. There's a commitment that has to happen to practice because it's like going to the gym, right? Like, which I don't do that much anymore, but it's still a good example. Like, you can't expect to get big biceps or something if you go and you do curls once a month. It's just not going to happen, right? So there needs to be a commitment to practice. And my teacher often says that if we can get to the point where meditation is like brushing our teeth, we couldn't imagine leaving the house without doing it, then we're in a good spot. When I mentor folks, I try to be a little bit nice about it and say, hey, practice every day, 5 days a week, or practice every day, 6 days a week, because stuff happens. But I think that's really, really important. We have to build some degree of consistency with mindfulness practice, particularly in the modern world, right? Because we're actually training ourselves against mindfulness all day long. As soon as we open our phone and we're slicing our attention every time we scroll up, down, or left, right, whatever it is you're doing, like we're slicing our attention. We're truncating it, we're breaking it apart. And so you almost have to practice mindfulness daily just to stave off the deleterious effects of what the modern world is doing to our minds. But that's a completely different conversation, probably. I think I covered the facets of what I do
I think you
to
did. I don't think you
in
missed
fact,
any there. Yeah,
did I
yeah.
get it?
I think
Try-
with meditation, though, there's one thing that I remember you having said before. I don't think it was in that story, although maybe you did allude to it there now that I reflect, which I think is interesting to maybe bring up in the context of dealing with addiction, that it's possible to use meditation as just another way of checking out and
Mm, mm.
avoiding reality rather than becoming, more skilled at facing it as it is. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about, firstly, how that manifests, and particularly perhaps from your own experience, but also how to avoid it and what you can say to people who are starting out as meditators that will help them do something fruitful rather than just sit in the corner and get irritable or bliss out in some fantasy land that's got nothing to do with paying attention.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're referring to is it is in my story in the Recovery Dharma book,
Mm.
and it's essentially I didn't have a lot of direction in the beginning. I was in the county jail. I was just reading books, and I tried to roll with what I thought I knew about meditation, which was very little. It comes to be that it was very little. And so I essentially thought that if I could sit on my bunk in the county jail and just like close my eyes and zone out to the world, I thought that I was meditating, right? Like, and ironically, I could sit for long periods of time when I was doing that. I could sit for an hour, 2 hours, and stuff like that in the county jail. And what I really found was that I spent the bulk of my time uh, not bringing attention to what was arising in my mind, not bringing attention to what was going on in my body. In fact, I don't even think I had any notion that I needed to be embodied in any way. If anything, I was just lost in fantasy. That's really what it was. And I think, and I think I mentioned this in the story too, I don't know if that was necessarily a bad thing for me at the time, because I was dealing with a lot of pain. I was dealing with a lot of suffering. And so a habit pattern was still formed during that period of time of like integrating some, even if it was just a meditative posture, integrating that into my life. And it wasn't really until reading a lot more books, like kind of finding myself in the more insight, Theravada or Vipassana kind of like world of Buddhism, that I started to see like, oh, I need to start paying attention to what's actually happening, that this is an attentional training. And honestly, there are meditation practices out there. Have you ever used the Insight Timer app? Like
Yes.
you can find some funky stuff on there, man. Like there's like alien I'm not going to talk trash, but there's some, let's just say there's some very interesting stuff on there that probably would class be not too different from maybe what was happening for me when I was doing early practice. And so I think what's important, I think, is to say meditation in the context of what we're practicing in the Insight tradition, the Theravada tradition, Buddhism in general has particular qualities. And so when we're talking about mindfulness and training our attention, then fantasy is not where we're trying to go with it. Um, and that's if I was going to give instructions to a newcomer, um, it's typically going to be something involving breath, body, some degree of learning to experience the body through the body, and when the mind wanders, just come back. And when the mind wanders, come back. And that sort of meditation instruction, not surprisingly, is not typically the type that a newcomer can sit for an hour or two at a time, right? Because it doesn't come with like almost the pleasurable fantasies that I was experiencing, right? And that's of course why I was able to sit for longer periods of time, is because I was really just it's very pleasant to fantasize, particularly when your environment really sucks and what you're fantasizing about doesn't. And so I think when people new to practice who aren't for some reason already like kind of prone to this skill set, I think they're going to find that 10 minutes of practice is probably a lot in the very beginning in terms of the frustration that can arise. But that I encourage folks to try to practice for 20 minutes at a time, just with the breath or with the body, and then when the mind wanders, come back. That's like the basic instruction. I don't know what I can say to tell people or help people avoid fantasy, because it's the nature of the mind to do it. As soon as the discomfort arises uh, during the sitting practice, whether it's discomfort like literally in the body because you're sitting, or whether it's discomfort just because your mind is agitated that's not getting entertained in some capacity. It's going to want to grasp at things, just like it wants to, chase pleasure and avoid pain. It's going to want to avoid the discomfort that comes with being in your own skin for the first time. And in the modern world, we have so much distraction. We can't sit in line at the supermarket without scrolling our phones. I mean, you can't go to the doctor's office and sit quietly for 10 minutes without scrolling the phones. And so you put someone on a cushion and say, hey, sit here doing nothing really, but paying attention without scrolling your phone. That's inherently uncomfortable. Um, but it will point towards how addicted we actually are to our distractions. And maybe that's just the general way we have to approach it. We are now, as a society, addicted to being distracted, and therefore there's going to be a certain degree of discomfort as soon as you set the intention to not be distracted. So yeah, the mind is going to want to avoid the discomfort that comes with that. We don't have our fix when we sit down on the cushion and close our eyes and decide to be still. We don't have our fix, and so people are going to fantasize. So I'm not going to say avoid it. I'm going to say do your best to recognize it as soon as it happens and then come back, right? And that's really the muscle we're trying to strengthen with mindfulness practice anyhow. The mind's going to do what the mind does, but do we have the capacity to recognize the mind as it does these things so that we don't have to let it take us for a ride?
Thank you. And even as you say, just observing the way in which the mind takes us for a ride all the time is already sowing the seeds of being able to do something about it. One of my teachers likes to say, in fact, notice that urge to get the phone out and just pay attention to that for a bit instead of actually acting on it. Yeah.
Well, and if you practice consistently, you're going to notice you start to recognize patterns, right? Like what are the habit patterns of my particular mind? Does my mind act this particular way when I meditate in the morning, and this particular way in the afternoon or the evening, on weekends or weekdays? I notice that my meditation practices, I tend to practice in the morning in my car before working, but it's a very different practice when I'm practicing in the evening. Because in the morning, I notice I've got this day ahead of me. And so there's like kind of an inclination for planning, worrying, what do I need to do? Whereas my meditation practice at night tends to be more fruitful in the sense of tranquility or calm, and my meditation practice in the morning tends to be more fruitful in the sense of like, what is my mind clinging to right now? Like what am I wrapped up in? I get more insight into that in the morning. And those are patterns that are nice to recognize too, because you're learning a lot about yourself in that process.
Thank you. Yeah. I guess we should rewind now, though, to clarify why you didn't wind up doing 400 years and instead were out within 7. That's obviously its own story. But I wonder if you could give us just a taste of what happened and how that changed your sentence and how that changed your life.
Yeah, I actually didn't imagine I would be saying this particular part of my story today. Now, it's public, so it's fine. Um, but what's the simple short version of it? As we know, I was stealing, and a couple of months before my last arrest, so this would have been February or so, 2005, I stole a safe. And when I opened that safe at home, I discovered terrible photographs of sexual abuse involving a child. So the owner of the safe had put these in the safe, and I found those. And because of my prior arrest and the three strikes law, it didn't make sense for me to walk into the police department and say, by the way, here I am. I've been, terrorizing the neighborhood, but I found these. Like that didn't seem like an option for me. So what I did is I actually sent them in anonymously to the police, and that man was arrested for what was in the photos. And I kind of continued to do what I was doing until I was arrested a couple of months later in April of 2005. But I did steal some things, incidentally, other things from that house that I was later caught with when I was arrested. And long story short, um, the police and the district attorney's office that were prosecuting this other man whose photos I'd found, they knew it was me that had turned them in. And he was, if I remember correctly, also facing a life sentence, though less than mine. don't, let's not get into how silly that is. Like he's got a little, I was facing 400 years to life. He was facing, I think, 25 to life for his crimes. Um, but he was trying to have the evidence thrown out. And the reason, and this is more technical legal stuff that we don't really need to get lost in the weeds for, but essentially because the photos had been discovered through the commission of a crime, which is true, his and because the crime had been brought to the attention of the police anonymously, there was really no guaranteeing. Sorry, I had a noise nearby. There was
No.
really no guaranteeing that the police themselves hadn't acquired the evidence illegally. And so the person who was prosecuting him came to visit me in the county jail and asked that I testify that I had stolen the safe, that I had been the one to turn it in. And of course, that meant I couldn't, if I did this sort of thing, I couldn't mount my own defense, right? Because if I went to trial and there was a recording of me admitting that I had stolen stuff, then there was no sense of me going to trial because I would get convicted, right? I should point out that the reason I could go to trial was because I never actually got caught stealing anything. I had been caught in possession of stolen property, but they were charging me with the actual burglaries, right? And between all of us, I definitely did it, but they didn't have evidence that I had done it. And so I was going to go to trial and hope that I just got convicted of possession of stolen property. But if I did this testimony, then I couldn't do that. So I still agreed to do it. I still went on the record saying that I'm the only person that had possession of that safe, and I am the one who sent those photos into the police. And that prosecutor did me the favor of going to the local media and telling them that this guy, me, was risking the rest of his life in prison in order to get the conviction of this other man, but that her boss was still trying to get life in prison for me. And it hit the front page of the newspapers. And it ran for a few weeks. And I want to say about a month later, they came off the life sentence thing and offered me a plea bargain. So I eventually took the 14-year plea bargain and served about half of it. And that is why I'm still here today. And
Wow.
to be honest, like it's I had about an 18 or 20 month period where I thought that I was going to do the rest of my life in prison. And it was a really, really, really dark period of my life. And yes, it's where I started to find recovery. And yes, it's where I started practice. But it was a really, really dark period of my life. And I had a lot of, we've all heard of like near-death experiences before, you know, when someone says like, I almost died and my life flashed before my eyes. Well, facing life in prison felt like a near-death experience, but it didn't, my life didn't flash before my eyes. It was more like a really long, drawn out, painful life review with it ending like kind of like in that moment that I was living in. It was like, this is my life now. That's everything that I've done. That's it. Book is closed. And so when I didn't get the life sentence, I really, really, really felt like I got a second chance. Like or third chance to be more accurate. But I really feel like this is it. I need to make the most of it. Like I'm on borrowed time. I still feel like I'm on borrowed time today. I mean, it's been 19 years now, and I might be coming up for if I only got 25 years of life, I might be coming up on my first parole hearing in a couple of years, you know? And so everything that's happened since then, all this beauty in my life today, it's all just bonus. And it's what inspires me to carry the message. It's what inspires me to keep doing what I'm doing, because I feel like, you know, maybe, I mean, I'm not a magical thinker. I'm not typically, I'm not a God-fearing guy. I'm not particularly like mystical, but sometimes I can't help but think that maybe things worked out this way for a reason. So I'll just roll with it, whether it's true or not.
I salute you for doing what you did, but I feel moved to ask some purposefully naive questions that you know I appreciate may sound ridiculous, but yeah, what made you turn those photos in the first place, knowing the potential risk? I guess you thought you could get away with doing it anonymously, but Was there not some part of you that thought it would be so much easier just to stay away from all of this? I'm, a criminal, and any involvement with law enforcement is a bad idea.
I never, it never crossed my mind not to.
Mm.
Uh, there was I had an acquaintance that I did the burglary with, and when I opened the safe and showed the photos to him and told him what my intentions were, which was to turn it in, he said, "I just want nothing to do with this. I think you should throw them out, but I want nothing to do with this." I said, "Well, I'll do something with them, and you'll never have to worry about being involved in it." And he still remains a mystery figure, at least for the public, obviously, to this day. But it never crossed my mind because, I mean, uh, I was causing a lot of harm to people, but this felt like a significantly different level of harm. Um, and I know that folks like to portray people in the midst of drug addiction and crime and things like this as total sociopaths. In fact, I think I was once characterized that way by like the probation department when they were trying to come up with like a psychological survey of my type, right? People who steal the way I did. I think they called me a sociopath, but um, my own personal experience with myself is that, hey, that's just not true. And my experience living with other people in prison is it's not true. Are there people with sociopathic tendencies? Yes, but like there's certain types of harm that we, even those who harm others, aren't willing to live with, aren't willing to watch happen, and that was one of them. And yeah, I don't know the best way to answer that because it wasn't much of a dilemma for me. The dilemma was how to do it, right? How can I do this and protect myself as best as possible? Not should I do this?
And then the second part of it is, when that approach came from the prosecutor, again, you had to take a risk, and hope for the best. Was there any doubt in your mind at that moment? Again, obviously, I feel this is the right thing to do, but I'm not necessarily going to get any reward for it. This is an action that is just sort of, yeah, literally a wing and a prayer. Um,
Uh, so before doing the interview with the prosecutor, I spoke with my attorney, and he gave me good attorney advice. Right? He said, "Don't go on the record here uh, admitting to stealing the safe." Right? Even though that's what I would have to do if I went on the stand. He said, "Don't go. Tell them what you found in the safe." Without saying how you necessarily acquired it. Tell them that you sent them in. Tell them like, and so he was giving me good advice because he's the guy that would be representing me if I went to trial and had to present evidence. So he's giving me good advice. So when I first went in and did the interview with the prosecutor and her investigator, she told me like, "Hey, I'm not. There's no deal here. I'm not offering you a deal. Um, like if you tell me the truth here and you're getting sentenced at some point, sure, I'll show up for you and things like that. But I can't offer you a deal. It's not like you're going to not go to prison for doing this." She specifically said, "This is not law and order. That's not how this is going to work." And so the first round of questioning, I still protected myself a little bit in the sense that, oh, maybe I can do this and give her what she wants without admitting to stealing the safe, right? And so we did the round of questioning, and then she kind of pressed pause and she said, "Look, here's the problem. If I don't have a chain of custody from the place where it was stolen from to the moment it got into the hands of the police department, then the photographic evidence could get thrown out." And she says, "If you're that link, I need to know that." And then she started recording again, and we did the interview a second time because apparently they do them twice to kind of make sure everybody's got their facts straight, right? So police do this. They'll interview people with the same questions over and over again to see if they keep the same story type stuff. And I think she recognized the type of advice I'd gotten from my lawyer. So she essentially asked me, did anybody else other than you ever possess that safe from the moment it left the house where it was stolen from and to its opening, and then the photos to the police department? Did anybody else ever possess those photos? And I said, no, that was me. She said, "Are you willing to testify to how that happened?" And I said, "Yeah." And it happened because it just was the right thing. It was just the right thing to do. So even though I, like any human, had hesitancy and wanted to protect myself, like when I was actually pushed to the point where I recognized what the consequences of not being honest were, of not owning it, I knew what the right thing to do was. I guess it's like the night I found them. It's just like I knew what I had to do, even if I had to try to figure out negotiate a way around it. But I don't really think I had a way of negotiating my way around this particular one on that day.
Mm.
Um, and so, yeah, as a result, I mean, it's interesting. After the interview was over, my lawyer, when they left, the prosecutor left, and my lawyer said to me, "That was gold." That's what he said to me. He's like, "That was great." And I'm like, "But I totally admitted to it." And he's like, "It doesn't matter." And I realized that he wanted me to do one thing, but his lawyerly advice had to be something else. So
Gotcha.
he
Yeah.
couldn't say go on the record and tell them what happened. He couldn't say that because that would I don't know. I don't know if I could file suit or something later, but he couldn't tell me. He couldn't advise me to do that. But after I did it, he told me that that's what needed to happen. So yeah,
Wow.
those two particular moments, different moments, and ironically, the media stories focused on the first one, as
Mm.
if like the principal risk for me was actually in sending the thing in. But I feel like for me, the real risk was that moment a year and a half later, or a year later, in the county jail when they came to visit me. I feel like that was my moment where I had to really assess whether I was willing to take the risk or not.
Thank you. Yeah. And in light of that risk, I once saw somebody ask you, I can't remember whether it was on one of the threads under one of your articles or might have been a Reddit Q&A that you did. But somebody asked you about whether you felt that you were privileged, given the, dependence in this case on media coverage, really, creating a groundswell of public opinion behind what later came to you in the form of a plea bargain. And they were suggesting to you that, because you were a white guy from a good home, you were able to tell a story in a plausible way that was going to be taken in a certain light that might not have flown had you had a different skin color and a different upbringing. And I wonder what you thought about that question at the time it was asked, but also what you make of it now and how you see that as part of the process of your role of service in talking about these questions.
Well, I am privileged. I grew up privileged, and white guy in America, straight white guy in America. There is privilege there. I think it's worth teasing two things apart there, though. One,
Hmm.
I think the story. I mean, I'm trying to be an objective observer. I don't know anything about this. I pick up a news article about Bob, whoever, who discovers those photos and then turns them in. I think that story is probably going to resonate with people regardless of the particular privileged background of the person involved, right?
Hmm.
Now, I suppose some of the question could be whether that story would have ever made it to the media
Yep.
in the first place. That's possible. It's possible. I had an attorney, but at the same time, like the story wove its way because of an off the record conversation I'd had with police at some point. With that said, uh, I think there's a strong possibility that if I wasn't the color I am today, if I didn't have a paid attorney rather than a public defender, um, that I'd be doing the rest of my life in prison.
Hmm.
I think there's a strong possibility that even if I'd received the 14-year prison term that I did, and I didn't have a family with financial resources, um, a family that was intact such they could support me the whole time I was in prison, a family that was willing to pay for me to go to college while I was in prison and keep me fed, right? Because they don't feed you a lot in prison, so to keep money on my sorry, like bank account. That's a prison bank account.
Hmm.
To
Hmm.
keep money on my books while I was in prison. A family is willing to support me in my intellectual and spiritual endeavors while I was in prison. You know, like all those books that were coming from Amazon, I wasn't paying for that stuff. a family who supported me when I came home and helped me rent an apartment and give me the resources necessary so that I could transition over to university, because I got into University of California at Berkeley just a couple of months after coming home from prison. I had an enormous amount of support from them. A father who gave me a car, which I wouldn't have been able to afford. Like, just like all of that is absolutely part and parcel of why I'm sitting here today, a relative success story,
Hmm.
after having spent almost a decade of my life in two separate prison terms in prison. And yeah, there's privilege built into that. Absolutely. Um, I mean, the goal, of course, in the long term is to transform the prison system itself so that the resources that people on the streets, like my family, had to pay for, um, to make prison a transformative experience for me, are available to everybody, regardless of the resources they may or may not have on the street. That would be one goal if we're assuming that prisons are still uh, present and happening. Of course, I'd love to transform the prison system itself so that incarceration happens in a different fashion, but that's of course a different conversation. And to give people the same resources when it comes to that I had coming home. Like, you think a person who goes to prison for 10 or 15 years, who's lost so many ties to community and to family, and is given $200 when they leave the gate, half of which they probably have to use to even get on a bus to get back home. You think that $100 is supposedly supposed to suffice in a state like California that's very expensive in terms of food, housing? Like, what do you expect them to do when they get home?
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, like, I have privilege. There's no doubt about that. And yeah, how can we make it so it's not privilege? Make it so that's the baseline. How can we make it so folks, when they're coming home, and they are coming home, like 95 or something percent of people in prison in the United States are coming home. They are going to be our neighbors. And I think we have to ask ourselves, how do we want them coming home? Because we're responsible for how they come home. As much as we want to think of them as paying for their crimes and it's up to them what they do in there, ultimately we're responsible for how they come home, and they are coming home. So, uh, sorry, probably going on a little bit of a tangent there too, but it's why I give back. And I feel like at some point in my not terribly distant future, I'd love to pivot to just doing prison work entirely, but I'm not quite there yet. I still have to have a day job, but I think I feel called in some capacity to do that sort of stuff, um, with all of my time, just trying to figure out how I can make that happen.
Not tangential at all. I think it feeds back into the fundamental principles of Dharma practice, the absolute centrality of Sangha, and the recognition of interdependence, and the fact that we can't do it all alone. And I remember being told years ago by a friend who was in 12-step recovery that my approach to just trying to give up unhelpful habits was white knuckling my way through in an unlikely to succeed kind of a way. And I didn't necessarily buy that from the point of view of my ability to stay off substances, but I did see that I had no connection to a network of peers. And I was fortunate to have other supports in my life. I mean, I had a relatively privileged start myself. So, I'm not going to suggest that I was disadvantaged in some way, but I do see the importance of community around not just practice more broadly, whoever you are, but in this process of trying to transform something that has been almost life-wrecking into the first step towards rebuilding. And without other people's help, the way you've just painted it, it's hard to imagine how anybody could succeed.
Yeah, and the people that we write off, uh, I met people inside, lifers, right? Guys had been in there and they weren't necessarily ever coming home. Uh, and You'd have to know a little bit about the prison system in California, but if let's say you get a 25 years to life sentence, maybe at 22 or 23 years, you'll have a preliminary appearance in front of a parole board to kind of like look at what you've done when you're in prison, and like, what's your behavior like? And they'll say, oh, you didn't learn a vocational trade, or you should learn a vocational trade, or oh, you need to uh, do anger management classes, or more 12-step, or something like that. And so folks, in a particular prison who have this life sentence are going to do everything that's available to them, right? Uh, Anger management classes, drug programs, and stuff. And like 90% of that stuff is volunteer run. Like that's with the exception of like some of the vocational training. Like I learned to weld while I was in prison. Almost everything else, like that's all volunteer run. That's like people in communities outside the prison coming in to help them have those resources. And then these lifers will, and maybe in the beginning they're just doing it to make the parole board happy. Like they don't actually care about personal transformation. They just know they have to check these boxes to make the parole board happy. And so they do this thing for 4 or 5 years at one prison, and then they basically exhausted all the resources that are available at that prison, and then they move to a different prison because we have lots of them in California. And then there's a whole new smorgasbord of programs there. Like maybe there's still a Christian group or a Catholic group or a Buddhist group or things like that that are familiar, but it's going to be a whole new set of stuff. And then they do that, and they'll exhaust their resources, and they'll go to another prison, and so they'll bounce around for decades in the prison system, doing all these different, like kind of this eclectic spiritual practices, personal transformation practices, recovery related, anger related, therapeutic communities, all this stuff. And then they'll end up at a prison, and someone like me will come in, and I'll run into this guy who's been in prison for 30 or 35 years. And he's like literally a spiritual giant. And what started out as I know I realize I went a different direction with this, but here we are. What started out as a guy who was just taking an anger management class in hope of like pleasing a parole board 2 decades from now. It's transformed the human being, right? These are people who have picked up, some of them Buddhist practices, some of them like I did whatever was available to me. So I did a lot of Catholic centering prayer because it was a meditation group. We sat silently. I could do whatever practice I needed to at the time. So they become these spiritual giants, and I like to call it like the prison spiritual tradition. But they're like they're gurus almost inside, and many of them are never ever coming home. But they were built by the communities outside. That's what's so interesting. Is like they have this practice. They have this mentorship relationship to all the other men in prison. These are people that mentored me. These are people that taught me the ropes, how to be in prison. And like navigate the racial politics and the violence, and also figure out a way to kind of maintain my integrity as a human being trying to become somebody different, and these people were all built by community, and these are the folks that aren't even ever coming home. So it's not even, I know I mentioned the people coming home, 95% of them, but then there's these other people that are never coming home, right or wrong, depending on how you look at it, and they too are supported and built by community, and those are the people that are mentoring the men and women that are coming home. So yeah, a little bit of interdependence going on here, and I want to be a part of that. I want to stay a part of that. I think I'm like well equipped, and kind of back to the privilege question. Something that came up when you asked the question that I then forgot to mention is that I do come from I have an eclectic background, right? Like I was in the drug world, I was in the crime world. I spent, 9-something years in prison, but I come from a privileged background. I come from a highly educated family. I've gone to pretty prestigious university. And so I'm a blue collar worker. I'm an elected union official. I'm an electrician by trade. I've been a firefighter. I've been a bookstore manager. We'll go through all these things, but I have this eclectic history. And my communication style is such that there are people that will listen to me because of what I look like and the type of language and communication styles I use, that will listen to me tell stories, my stories about prison. And those folks probably or might not listen to other people. And so there's an element of like me feeling a responsibility to use the privilege that I do have to tell the stories of the people in prison whose backgrounds or don't have the privilege and the capacity to be heard by those types of people, right? And so I suppose it's like garnering my privilege for the liberation of all as well, right? That's something that I don't do perfectly, but I try to be mindful of, and I can do when it's possible.
The dharmic motivation right there as well.
Yeah.
Using what we have and whatever merit might accrue, to offer that to the benefit of others. And I think, as you say, I mean, we have to see what we're called to personally and also skilled for. I did myself once train to teach yoga in prisons, and I did teach a couple of classes in Pentonville Jail in London, and I was terrified. And to be entirely honest, I think I did it to try and prove to myself that I could do it. And once I'd done it, I was like, okay, that's I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to provide what these guys are looking for. I mean, I could teach an asana class, I could say stuff, but I didn't feel like I had the presence or the voice to really represent what it was that they needed to hear. And in fact, they probably heard my fear more than anything else. So yeah, just
You
as
don't think that would have died down a little bit over time, though?
very possibly, very possibly. There were lots of other reasons. I moved out of London. There wasn't an immediate way to get into doing it regularly. I also transitioned out of teaching asana classes because there's so many people doing that. And we'll see. Maybe there's a time that I will consider that again. I was certainly drawn to the idea of it, but I think it was because I felt very fortunate that I'd never gone to jail rather than that I knew what it was like. And that was actually the first time I'd set foot in there when I went to teach my first class with supervision. And as I say, it was a real eye opener. And yeah, to see the obvious need for something like that to exist, and at the same time to question whether I'm best equipped to meet it was humbling. And yeah, it's something that it hasn't resolved itself fully yet for me, but
Well,
it
maybe it's
certainly
out there in the future anyhow.
we'll see.
Maybe you only teach asana in jail.
That could be one way. Yeah, yeah.
Maybe you don't want to do it in the outside world, but I know that if you did do it inside, they'd appreciate the heck out of you.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. And
Um,
for you, in terms of the future, I remember reading you talking about writing a book because you've got so many stories here that are layered in so many ways that it would be a very rich book and probably at the same time, therefore, a very hard book to finish because there's always a little bit more to feed into the picture. I wonder how that's going.
I wonder how many, probably going on a decade now, how many podcasts or interviews I want to do where I actually say, yeah, I'm going to write a book and don't have one. Because my problem, uh, besides having a full-time job, right, is I say yes to probably too many opportunities. And I haven't found the time to, I mean, I've got stuff written, but I haven't found the time to really just like plow through the remainder of it. And then the stuff that I have written, I'm so different than the person who started writing it. And then so I read it and I'm like, well, that needs revising too. But I'm just saying yes to opportunities. And so like, as they arise and they seem more pressing, whether it's taking stuff into San Quentin State Prison and like helping devise content for the people inside for the Mindful Prisons program, or whether it's doing which you did recently, the BCBS Satipatthana stuff. Like I was invited to do kind of shadow teaching for those courses because Analio's trainings were have been really important for me in my practice, and I was asked to shadow teach for the purposes of teaching them myself in the future, which I'm going to do. And that's like an opportunity I have a hard time saying no to. Or I'm currently
Sure.
in I'm in one and starting another, so I'll have two simultaneous Dharma teacher trainings that I'm a member of for the next couple of years. And like these seem pertinent and pressing and important. And as much as I want to write the book, it just always gets the back burner because there's also stuff right in front of me that I keep saying yes to. And maybe I need to practice some restraint or renunciation around some of that stuff. I don't know, but it's all important, fulfilling stuff. So I just keep saying yes, and I figure the book will happen if it needs to and when it needs to.
Mm. Yeah, I think you can trust in that. I mean, you've written a lot already, and it's available, and I'll link to where people can read some of that in the notes to go with this episode. But I see in there, rich potential. I think to tie it together in a way that maybe wasn't apparent at the time you were doing that first phase of writing. Because it maybe will come into the fullness of what it is you're going to present as you really step into this Dharma role that you are already embodying and can then bring into the prison context more fully, perhaps. So your story will be part of a bigger picture of stories that you're helping to seed through your actions.
May it be so.
Here's
May it be
hoping.
so. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Matthew. It's been a really rich and fascinating conversation. I do sense we could carry on for a lot longer, but I did promise at the beginning I would try and keep it brief. I think I failed miserably to stick to the the target, but hopefully those who are listening have enjoyed and found it beneficial. I thank you again for taking the time and for everything that you're offering and the magnanimous and yeah, calm and centered way in which you do it. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you for asking me. It was a pleasure.